The old woman's scream pierced the night, sending dogs barking in the narrow alleys of ID City. But it wasn't fear that made her cry out. It was heartbreak. Her grandson, Dao, had just stumbled home at 3 a.m., reeking of cheap liquor and wearing someone else's blood on his knuckles. "Why do you do this to me?" she whispered, her voice trembling as she reached for his cut hand. Dao yanked it away, letting out a cruel laugh that echoed through their small home. The sound was nothing like the innocent giggles she remembered from when he was small, before he learned that his first cry had been his mother's last breath. In IAD, rumors spread faster than morning fog, and everyone knew Dao's story. They whispered it in marketplaces and tea houses, how his mother had died bringing him into the world, how his grandmother had raised him alone, and how that same loving grandmother had created a monster through her own guilt and grief. Every time she looked at Dao, she saw her dead daughter's eyes staring back, and those eyes paralyzed her ability to discipline him. "Let the boy be," she would tell concerned neighbors, her hands nervously smoothing her faded apron. "He has suffered enough." But suffering, as IED's elders knew well, was no excuse for cruelty. They watched Dao grow from a sullen child into a terror of the streets, his reputation spreading like wildfire through the ancient city's winding alleys. Market vendors developed a sixth sense for his approach. At the first glimpse of his swagger, they would quickly cover their most valuable wares, not because they feared theft, though that too was a legitimate concern, but because they couldn't bear to watch him destroy their precious goods for sport. His laughter, sharp as broken glass, would echo off the city's weathered walls as he reveled in their fear. Inside their modest home, his grandmother lived in two worlds. In one, she was the respected widow who had sacrificed everything to raise her orphan grandson. In the other, she was the failed matriarch who had allowed grief to blind her to her grandson's growing darkness. Every night, when Dao was out terrorizing the city, she would kneel by her bed, her tears falling onto hands worn rough from decades of labor. "Please," she would pray, her forehead pressed against clasped hands, "let him find his way back to light." But the gods, if they were listening, seemed to have other plans for Dao. The city of Ad itself appeared to hold its breath when Dao prowled its streets. This ancient place had witnessed countless troubled souls over its long history. But something about Dao was different. He didn't just break rules. He seemed to delight in breaking spirits. Each act of cruelty was like a badge he wore proudly, as if trying to punish the world for the crime of his birth. Each morning, his grandmother would rise before dawn, her old bones protest as she prepared his favorite breakfast. The smell of fresh bread and spiced eggs would fill their small kitchen as she worked, hope rising with the steam from the cooking pots. Perhaps today would be the day her love would finally reach him. Perhaps today, the boy who had cost his mother her life would finally understand that he didn't have to spend his own life making others pay for that long-ago tragedy. But morning after morning, Dao would stumble in late, his eyes bloodshot and vacant, barely acknowledging the feast of love laid before him. He would shovel the food into his mouth mechanically, deaf to his grandmother's gentle attempts at conversation, blind to the pain in her eyes as she watched another failure unfold. The older residents of IAD, those who remembered when Dao's mother walked these same streets with kindness in her heart, watched this daily drama with growing unease. They had seen enough of life to know that the gods of IAD did not tolerate such disrespect forever. In their wisdom, they could sense that Dao was rushing headlong toward a reckoning, one that would shake not just his world, but the very foundations of everything he thought he knew about life, death, and the thin line between them. The morning sun had barely touched the market stalls when Madame Chen began arranging her oranges. Her arthritis-twisted fingers moved slowly but deliberately, stacking each fruit into perfect pyramids that gleamed like small suns. At 72, she had been selling fruit in IAD's marketplace longer than most of the other vendors had been alive. These oranges represented her entire week's income, money that would buy her grandson's medicine. She felt Dao's presence before she saw him, like a cold wind that made her bones ache more than usual. The other vendors had already begun their practiced routine of turning away, pretending to be busy, hoping to avoid his attention. But Madame Chen couldn't move quickly enough. Dao's shadow fell across her carefully arranged display. Without a word, he began stuffing oranges into his bag, his movements deliberately slow, taunting. His eyes, cold as winter frost, dared her to object. Please. Madam Chen's voice quavered. My grandson's medicine. Dao's laugh cut through the morning air like a knife. Medicine? He kicked the wooden crate supporting her display, sending oranges cascading across the dusty ground. They rolled between feet of shocked onlookers, who stood frozen in horror, but didn't dare intervene. Maybe he should learn to live without it. As Madame Chen fell to her knees, her old hands trembling as she tried to gather her scattered livelihood, Dao bit into one of the stolen oranges. Juice ran down his chin as he watched her struggle, his enjoyment of her distress evident in his smirk. The crowd's angry mutters meant nothing to him. He had long since learned that their disapproval was as toothless as their threats. Later that same week, Dao's cruelty found a new target. Old Master Wu, respected for his decades of teaching at the local school, was making his way across the street with his wooden cane. Each step was a careful negotiation between willpower and aging joints. From his perch near the tea shop, Dao watched the old man's painfully slow progress with growing amusement. Look, everyone! Dao's voice boomed across the street. Master Wu is giving us a dance performance. He began to mimic the elderly teacher's movements, exaggerating each shuffle, each trembling step. His mockery drew unwilling laughter from some younger passersby, though their amusement died quickly when they saw the pain in Master Wu's eyes. The old teacher paused, turning slowly to face his tormentor. His eyes, still sharp despite his failing body, fixed on Dao with a penetrating gaze. Young man, he said, his voice steady despite his humiliation, remember this moment. The wheel of karma turns slowly, but it turns without fail. Dao merely rolled his eyes and walked away, already bored with his victim's philosophical warnings. But he would remember those words later, when the wheel indeed began to turn. But it was at home where Dao's cruelty cut deepest. His grandmother had spent weeks cleaning houses in the wealthy part of town, saving every coin, hiding them under her thin mattress like precious secrets. The money was meant for food, for her heart medicine, for the small offerings she still made at Dao's mother's shrine. She counted them every night, whispering prayers of gratitude for each one. Dao found her treasure on a Tuesday. He had been searching for anything he could sell or gamble, his movements growing more frustrated until he heard the telltale clink of coins beneath the mattress. His grandmother returned from the market to find him counting her savings at the kitchen table. That's for our food, she said softly, her voice barely a whisper. For the medicine, food? Dao scattered the coins across the table with a sweep of his arm. Medicine? This isn't even enough for a decent bet. He gathered the coins roughly, several falling to clatter across the floor. I'll put it to better use. His grandmother's tears meant nothing to him as he pushed past her. He couldn't see how she sank to her knees, gathering the fallen coins with trembling fingers, each one representing hours of back-breaking work. He didn't hear her prayers at night, as she knelt beside her bed, begging any god who would listen to save her grandson's soul before it was too late. But the gods of Ai had been watching. They had witnessed every tear Madame Chen shed over her scattered oranges, every painful step Master Wu took under the weight of mockery, every quiet sob his grandmother tried to muffle in her pillow. And in their ancient wisdom, they knew that some lessons could only be taught through terror. Some changes could only be forged through fear. As Dao swaggered through the streets that evening, his pockets heavy with his grandmother's stolen savings, he was blissfully unaware that his next act of cruelty would be his last as a free man. The wheel of karma that Master Wu had spoken of was already in motion, its momentum gathering like a storm on the horizon. The mortuary at the edge of town waited in silence, its cold chambers holding secrets that would soon teach Dao the true meaning of respect. The mortuary stood at the edge of Aida like a boundary between worlds, its gray walls holding secrets that the living were never meant to disturb. But Dao, drunk on cheap wine and his own arrogance, saw it as nothing more than another chance to prove his fearlessness to his gang of followers. They say the dead sleep here like logs, he announced, swaying slightly as he faced his friends in the dying light. Let's wake them up. His friends exchanged nervous glances. Even the bravest among them felt the weight of ancient taboos pressing down like a physical force. But Dao was already moving toward the back entrance, his swagger masking the slight tremor in his hands. The mortuary's interior was a study in shadows and silence. Metal tables gleamed dully under flickering fluorescent lights, their occupants hidden beneath white sheets. The air hung heavy with the sharp bite of disinfectant, barely masking other, more primal smells. Look at them all. Dow's voice echoed unnaturally in the sterile space. Lined up like merchandise, he moved between the tables, his bravado growing with each step. His friends huddled near the door, their faces pale in the artificial light. That's when Baba Deji, the mortuary attendant, emerged from his office. His eyes, ancient and knowing, took in the scene with a mixture of anger and resignation. Young man, his voice carried the weight of decades spent walking between worlds. This is not a place for your games. Dow's response was to laugh, the sound bouncing off cold tile walls. But his laughter died when his eyes fell on one particular table. Something about the shape beneath the sheet caught his attention. With a theatrical flourish, he pulled back the covering. Abeni lay there, her face still holding traces of the beauty that life had denied proper appreciation. According to the small card at the foot of her table, she had died alone, unclaimed by any family. What Dao did next would haunt him for the rest of his life. In a moment of unthinkable disrespect, he reached out and touched her, his mocking caress a violation that transcended death itself. Stop! Baba Deji's voice cracked like thunder. You know not what forces you tempt. But Dao was already turning away, laughing as he gestured for his friends to follow. None of them saw the silent tear that rolled down Abeni's cold cheek, or the way her fingers twitched ever so slightly in the empty air. That night, Dao's world began to unravel. The first sign came as he lay in his bed, the room spinning slightly from alcohol. A whisper, soft as a lover's breath, carried his name through the darkness. When he bolted upright, the room was empty, but the air had grown thick and cold. The paralysis took his voice first. He woke to find his tongue frozen, his mouth refusing to form words. His grandmother's panic when she found him standing in her doorway, silent tears streaming down his face, marked the beginning of their shared nightmare. Objects began to move on their own. Doors would slam in empty rooms. The temperature would drop suddenly, turning breath to mist even on the warmest days. But worst of all were the dreams, visions of Abeni, her face both beautiful and terrible, reaching for him with cold hands that left real bruises on his skin. His grandmother watched helplessly as her grandson withered, his proud frame becoming gaunt, his arrogant eyes now haunted by unseen horrors. The doctors could find no physical cause for his affliction. The local wise women shook their heads and refused to help, sensing something beyond their power to remedy. It was Mama, their elderly neighbor, who finally named what everyone else feared to speak. This is no ordinary sickness, she told Dao's grandmother over tea one evening. The dead have claimed him. The return to the mortuary felt like a procession to judgment. Baba Deji waited for them at the entrance, his face grave but not unkind. I warned you, he said simply, leading them inside. The dead do not forget disrespect. In his small office, surrounded by ancient books and burning incense, Baba Deji revealed the price of Dao's redemption. Abeni died alone, unloved and unmourned. Her spirit cannot rest until she receives what life denied her, a husband's devotion. The spiritual wedding was conducted in the same room where Dao had committed his transgression. Abeni's body, dressed in white, seemed to glow under the harsh lights. Dao, trembling but resigned, placed a ring on her cold finger as Baba Deji chanted ancient prayers. The transformation that followed was profound. Dao's voice returned gradually, but the arrogance never did. He became known in ID not for his cruelty, but for his gentle respect toward all, especially the elderly and the vulnerable. Every month without fail, he visited Abeni's grave, bringing fresh flowers and whispered prayers. Some said they saw him talking to her headstone for hours, sharing the stories of his changed life with the wife he never knew in life. He returned to Madame Chen's stall in the market, not to steal, but to pay for what he had taken, with interest. He helped Master Wu cross the street whenever their paths crossed. But most importantly, he became the grandson his grandmother had always prayed he would be. In IED today, parents tell their children the story of Dao and his ghostly bride. They speak of how the dead taught the living about respect, and how even the coldest heart can be warmed by the touch of true remorse. And in a quiet cemetery at the city's edge, a well-tended grave bears witness to a promise kept. Its headstone reads simply, Abeni, beloved wife, never forgotten. Fresh flowers always grace its base, placed there by a man who learned too late that respect is not a choice, but a sacred duty, and that sometimes the dead must teach what the living could not.